Catherine Parr was the sixth and final wife of King Henry VIII of England, the notorious Tudor monarch that was most famous for his marital escapades. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. The iconic rhyme simplifies the story of Henry and his wives, with Catherine reduced to simply being the wife who survived. But Catherine tragically only survived Henry by little over 1 year, dying in the summer of 1548. Sadly, that would not be the end of Catherine's story. In this video, I'm going to explore the life and death of Catherine Parr and then recount the story of what happened to her remains in the hundreds of years following her death. If you like this video, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and click the notification bell so you'll be notified when I post more mini documentaries like this one. Thank you for watching. Catherine Parr was the daughter of Sir Thomas Parr of Kendal and his wife Matilda Green of Greens Norton in Northamptonshire. She was born in 1512 and named Catherine to honor Queen Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII. Like many women of that time, the exact date of Catherine's birth went unrecorded, but she was followed by a brother, William, born in 1513, and a sister, Anne, born in 1515. In 1529, when Catherine was 17 years old, she married Sir Edward Burr. Catherine's first husband was in his 20s at the time of their marriage, and may have been in poor health, as by the spring of 1533 he was dead. In the summer of 1534, Catherine married secondly John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer, her father's second cousin. The twice-widowed Latimer was nearly twice Catherine's age. From his first marriage to Dorothy de Vere, sister of John de Vere, 14th Earl of Oxford, he had 2 children, John and Margaret. By the winter of 1542, Lord Latimer's health had worsened, and Catherine nursed her husband until his death in 1543. It's unclear when exactly Catherine's relationship with Thomas Seymour began, but it seems likely that she became involved with him during the last few months of Lord Latimer's life. This would prove to be a grand passion, and in 1547, when she was finally free to be with the man that she loved, she wrote to him,
"I would not have you think that this mine honest goodwill towards you to proceed of any sudden motion of passion. For as truly as God is good, my mind was fully bent the other time I was at liberty to marry you before any man I know."
However, even before Lord Latimer's death, Catherine became aware that she had caught the attention of another, even more powerful suitor. Using her late mother's friendship with Henry's first queen, Catherine of Aragon, Catherine took the opportunity to renew her own friendship with the late queen's daughter, Lady Mary. By the 16th of February, 1543, Catherine had established herself as part of Mary's household, and it was there that Catherine caught the attention of the king. The date of Henry's proposal to Catherine was not recorded, but it would have taken place in the spring of 1543, after Lord Latimer's death. Catherine at first voiced her concern about becoming one of Henry's wives, boldly stating that,
"It were better to be your mistress than your wife."
However, Henry was persistent and told her that he wished her to become his wife. Catherine allegedly got on her knees before answering,
"Your Majesty is my master. I have but to obey you."
And while she was on her knees, she also prayed to God for guidance. The wedding of Catherine and Henry took place on the 12th of July, 1543, at Hampton Court Palace. Catherine had no children of her own, but had treated her stepdaughter, Margaret Neville, as if she was her own daughter, and when she married Henry, she adopted a similar relationship with her new stepchildren. She was already close friends with Lady Mary, and she also sought to befriend Henry's younger children, Edward and Elizabeth. Although Catherine is one of Henry's least famous wives, she was intelligent, accomplished, and passionate about her beliefs. She was the first Queen of England to have published a book, and in late 1547, she published her most famous work, Lamentation of a Sinner. Despite an attempt by the king's conservative ministers to turn the king against Catherine, she survived Henry's reign relatively unscathed, and when he died on January 28, 1547, he decreed in his will that Catherine should be given an allowance of £7,000 per year to support herself, and furthermore, she should be given the respect of a Queen of England, as though Henry were still alive. Shortly after Henry's death, Catherine's old flame, Thomas Seymour, returned to court, and he was quick to resume his pursuit of the newly widowed queen. Though Catherine had at first resolved to wait at least 2 years before remarrying, by late May 1547, the two were secretly married, and when this became public knowledge, it caused a small scandal. While the King and Lady Mary were insulted that Catherine would marry so soon after their father's death, the King's other sister, Lady Elizabeth, was less upset by the affair, and she chose to live in Catherine's household. Thomas's inappropriate behavior towards Lady Elizabeth during his marriage to her stepmother was infamous, though the Dowager Queen at first dismissed any concerns about his behavior. According to the deposition of Cat Ashley, Catherine appears not only to have acquiesced in episodes of horseplay, but actually to have assisted her husband. At the age of 35, and after 3 barren marriages, Catherine became pregnant, and it was during this time that Seymour began to take more of an interest in Elizabeth. Catherine could no longer deny the impropriety when she allegedly caught Seymour and Elizabeth in an embrace, and Elizabeth was sent away in May 1548 to stay with Sir Anthony Denny's household at Chestnut. She never saw Catherine again, although the two still corresponded frequently. In June 1548, Catherine, accompanied by Lady Jane Grey, moved to Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire, Thomas's baronial estate. On the 30th of August, 1548, Catherine gave birth to a daughter named Mary. The birth seemed to have been an easy one, but by the 3rd of September, she was gravely ill. According to Catherine's kinswoman, Lady Tyrwhitt, when she went to Catherine that morning, the Queen asked her where she had been, and before Lady Tyrwhitt could answer, she continued saying,
"That she did fear such things in herself, that she was sure she could not live."
By that time, she had already dictated her will, in which she left all of her worldly goods to her husband. Catherine had succumbed to puerperal or childbed fever, the same condition that had ended the life of her sister-in-law and predecessor as queen, Jane Seymour. By the time Lady Tyrwhitt entered Catherine's bedchamber, the queen was already suffering from the delirium characteristic of puerperal fever. According to Lady Tyrwhitt's account, Catherine turned to her and said,
"My Lady Turret, I am not well handled, for those that be about me care not for me, but stand laughing at my grief, and the more good I will to them, the less good they will to me."
Thomas, who was holding Catherine's hand at the time, shook his head, saying,
"Why, sweetheart, I would you no hurt."
Catherine, in her delirium, railed at her husband, saying,
"No, my lord, I think so."
before whispering loudly in his ear,
"But my lord, you have given me many shrewd taunts."
Catherine had been in a state of delirium for most of the morning, but at that moment, according to Lady Tyrwhitt, she believed that Catherine was remembering the drama involving Thomas and Elizabeth. Thomas then went to lie down with Catherine to try and comfort her. Despite the pain she felt at Seymour's betrayal, she still loved him, and during her moments of lucidity, she was comforted by his presence. In the early morning hours of September 5th, 1548, Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII, passed away at the age of 36, only 6 days after giving birth to her only child. Thomas arranged for a royal funeral to be prepared for her in the chapel at Sudeley Castle, with all ceremony as befitted a queen. Her funeral was conducted wholly in accordance with the reformed rites of the Church. Shortly after her death, her body was embalmed, sheathed in waxed cloth, and wrapped tightly with sheets of lead. She was placed in a lead coffin, which was carried in procession into the chapel, with the black-clad members of Catherine's household following solemnly. Thomas, by convention, was absent, and the mourners were led by the 10-year-old Lady Jane Grey. Catherine had been a steadying influence on Thomas Seymour, and after her death, he began to unravel. On the 20th of March, 1549, Thomas died on the executioner's block, after plotting to kidnap the king and overthrow the Lord Protector. The Act of Attainder that was passed, condemning Thomas to death, also confiscated all of his property, and Catherine's daughter was left penniless. She was eventually left in the care of the Duchess of Suffolk, Catherine's old friend. The Duchess, however, had difficulty paying for little Mary's household, and later in 1549, Parliament restored her lands and titles. In March 1550, the council granted money to Mary for household wages, servants' uniforms, and food. That is the last evidence of Mary's life, and it is believed that she died soon after. Catherine's longed-for child survived her mother by little more than 2 years. But this was sadly not the end of Catherine's tale. The chapel at Sudeley Castle was destroyed during the Civil War in the 17th century, and all records of Catherine's burial place were lost. In May 1782, however, a local resident named John Lucas discovered the site of Catherine's tomb, and after digging down 2 feet in depth, he came across her lead coffin. Once the lid of the coffin had been cleaned, he found an inscription which read,
K.P., 6th and last wife of King Henry VIII, 1548.
After opening the coffin and making a small incision in the body's wax cloth wrapping, Lucas found her body still perfectly preserved under its shroud, with the flesh of Catherine's arm being described as white and moist. After snipping a few pieces of Catherine's hair, a swatch of fabric from her gown, and stealing one of her teeth, Lucas sealed the coffin and covered it over once again. But his discovery would have dire consequences for the late Queen's remains. A cult of well-bred ladies began to flock to the tomb of Henry VIII's last wife, and in the summer of 1783, one Mrs. Bockett, a friend of the owner of Sudeley, Lord Rivers, returned to Catherine's grave once again and ordered the coffin to be opened to satisfy her own curiosity. According to her account, she found
Lucas's account of the coffin and corpse to be just as he had represented them, with this difference that the body was then grown quite fetid, and the flesh where the incision had been made was brown and in a state of putrefaction, in consequence of air having been let upon it.
Deterred by the stench of the corpse, she concluded her excavations and decided that a stone slab should be placed over the grave to prevent any future and improper inspection. But in May the following year, it was opened once more by some rude persons, who collected the body and left it exposed on a heap of rubbish until the parish vicar had it reinterred. In 1786, she was disturbed once again, this time by a Reverend Nash, who made a scientific exhumation of the body and described Catherine's face as
totally decayed, the teeth sound but had fallen out, and the hands and nails were entire of a brownish hue.
Reverend Nash wrote that he wished Catherine would someday be decently buried so she could rest in peace. By the late 18th century, the chapel's ruins were used for keeping rabbits, which further damaged Catherine's grave, as the rabbits
make holes and scratch very irreverently about her royal remains.
Throughout the final decades of the 18th century, Catherine's coffin would be opened several more times. In the 1790s, a pair of drunken gravediggers attempted to finally put the Queen to rest by gouging out a new grave for Catherine. However, they botched the job by burying her upside down. They further abused her corpse, with one source claiming that the pair pulled out the Queen's hair, knocked out several of her teeth, wrenched out her arms, and stabbed her torso several times with an iron bar before they pilfered the Queen's body parts to sell as souvenirs. Catherine's remains had become a macabre tourist attraction, a reminder of the barbarity of the Tudor era. 2 decades later, in 1817, Catherine's tomb was disturbed and disinterred for a final time. The rector of Sudeley resolved himself to launch repairs for the chapel, determined to find the place where the gravediggers had dumped Catherine's body. After a considerable search, the explorers found Catherine bottom upwards in a walled grave, and then moved her to a separate vault. The witnesses found nothing but the skeletal remains of the Queen, together with a few shreds of cloth and a small quantity of dark-colored hair. In 1828, a Mr. Lawson visited the chapel and reported that Queen Catherine's remains had still not been reburied with honor, and that the vault lay in a lean-to building outside the north wall of the chapel. When wealthy glove makers John and William Dent purchased Sudeley in 1837, they discovered the church to be ruinous and overgrown with ivy, the trees sprouting from its walls. They proceeded to carry out an extensive restoration program. In 1854 to 1863, the chapel was restored under the direction of Sir George Gilbert Scott. In 1861, her remains were collected and interred elsewhere, but by then her skeleton had been reduced to a little brown dust. Finally, in 1863, the renovation and rededication of the chapel was complete, and Catherine was interred in a Gothic canopied tomb in the medieval style. The arms of Catherine's 4 husbands are carved on the side of the tomb, and a life-size marble effigy designed by John Burney Phillip and based on portraits of the Queen rests atop it. This is where Catherine is resting to this day.